Thank you, Charlie. First, and good morning, everybody. The late Dr. John Creech had a distinguished horticultural legacy. He was the director of the National Arboretum. He also worked at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And after his retirement in Western North Carolina, he became sort of the interim director of the North Carolina Arboretum at Asheville. He's probably best known for introducing into cultivation the Japanese crepe myrtle, a seed of which he collected in 1956 off Yakushima Island, off Japan, and grew the plants up and distributed the seed around the country, including here at NC State University to Dr. Fred Cochran, who planted the seed here at the Arboretum, at the future Arboretum. And the entrance to the Arboretum is one of the plants from the original collection is Fantasy, which JC named in the early 1980s. So our speaker today is Leah Chester-Davis, who interviewed Dr. Creech on many occasions and also researched his life and legacy. She has worked at NC State University in the Extension Service group in the Successful Gardener program, where she worked with extension agents around North Carolina and produced a newsletter called Successful Gardener. And those newsletters were collected into a book with Toby Voss called The Successful Gardener's Guide to North Carolina. I think that's right here. More recently, she has worked at the Kannapolis campus of the North Carolina NC State University in a program called Plants for Human Health Institute, where she was known as the Produce Lady, which was a community outreach program. And currently, she's working on a consulting business called Faith, Food, and Health. Please welcome Leah Chester-Davis.
Hello. Hello. Thanks for your invitation today. I appreciate this opportunity to talk about John Creech. As Bobby said, and I'm just in a nutshell, just to recap, Dr. Creech and his career, he was a plant hunter for U.S. Department of Agriculture starting in the mid-1950s and up through early 1980s. He was the third director of the United States National Arboretum in Washington, D.C. And when he retired to North Carolina, he helped start the North Carolina Arboretum. John was born in 1920 in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. He was the son of a textile mill manager and was the youngest child of 3 children. His older brother and sister were quite a bit older than he was. And he really looked up to his older brother. Now, these are just pictures I've got to kind of evoke that time. His brother married into a pretty wealthy family in the area and had a farm and started raising both plants and animals. But as John explained, at that time in Rhode Island and the Northeast, the tomato industry went bust, and there were a lot of empty greenhouses dotting the landscape. And his brother dismantled one of the greenhouses, took it to his farm, and rebuilt it there. And John, as a youth, would spend lots of time at his brother's farm. His sister-in-law was really into plants, knew a lot about plants, took John under her wing and taught him about plants. And he absolutely loved that. And he worked in the greenhouse as well. When he was 16 years old and he could drive off of the farm for the first time, he had a defining moment in his life. He was asked to deliver a live chicken to a woman in town. And the woman met him at the door with a butcher knife and demanded that he chop off the chicken's head right there. And John was absolutely dumbfounded and just shocked. And in his hesitation, the woman, in one fell swoop, grabbed that chicken, chopped off the head, turned around, slammed the door in his face. And John was left standing down looking at the head of this severed chicken. And this severed chicken head. And he said right then, he knew plants were for him. And he said, plants are just cleaner. And so he goes back to the farm, and he spent his time from then on helping his brother in the greenhouse, raise the flowering baskets that would be sold for Decoration Day. At that time, Decoration Day, started in the Civil War area, was used to honor the dead, a tradition with people going to family burial plots and cleaning them and decorating them. And so he sold these flowers at roadside stands for his brother for Decoration Day. Kind of moved into now being Memorial Day, but still in some southern communities, there's still Decoration Day. It may be combined with Memorial Day, or it may be a separate day. But that's really how he got his start in horticulture. And because of that love, he ended up, oops, wrong button, Chris. Chris, show me which button to push. Can't see it in the dark here. So he enrolled in horticulture at Rhode Island State College, now the University of Rhode Island. And he graduated in 1941, May of 1941. Now, 1941, a major year in history, this country's history. When he graduated, we were not yet in World War II, but this country was edging closer to being in World War II. It wasn't long after he graduated that he received a summons to appear to serve in the Army. Of course, in 1941 is when Pearl Harbor, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. In 1942, he was part of the North Africa invasion. And that is where he was taken captive, prisoner of war, was sent to a prisoner of war camp in Poland, where he spent the rest of the war years. And there are some amazing stories about the war years. And in fact, that's really what pulled me into John's story. It was about the year 2005, 2006. I decided I was going to work on a novel. And I was working for NC State University at the time, so I was going to work on this novel on the side. I was based in the Charlotte area, but I had an office here in Raleigh. And anytime I was in Raleigh, and I stayed all night, and there was a Friends of the Arboretum lecture, I would come to the lecture. And one evening, I came to hear Tony Avent talk. And Tony talked about modern day plant exploration. And there was this sense of adventure, this quest to find the next plant. There was this whole sense of romance about going out and hunting plants. And I decided I wanted a plant hunter in my novel. And for some reason, I wanted my novel set in the 1950s. And so I talked to Bob Lyons and asked him if he knew of a plant hunter from that era that I might interview to get background information for my character. Bob mentioned John Creech, sent me to Dick Burr, also with NC State. Dick connected me to John Creech. So I went to talk to Dr. Creech for this character in my novel. And he started telling me these stories about his life. And at that time, that particular day, talked a lot about the war years. And I was so taken by his stories that I went back home and I wrote up some of these stories. I took back to him and asked him permission to send them to a publisher. And when he read them, he said to me, "You should work on my biography." So it's because of you that I'm here today talking about John Creech. And I had never shared that story with Tony Avent, but it was hearing about plant hunting that I decided I wanted this character in my book that led me to Dr. Creech. So I'm not going to talk a lot about those war stories because I'm going to talk about his horticultural legacy. They will be in the book, and they are pretty amazing. When he got out of the war, he returned to this country and he enrolled at the University of Massachusetts to study botany. It was when he was finishing up his program at the University of Massachusetts that he was in the library one afternoon and picked up a copy of the National Horticultural Magazine, the precursor to the American Gardener magazine. And he was reading an article about plant collection in Central America, and particularly the work with the cinchona trees, where they would strip off the bark to extract the alkaloid properties that contain quinine for treatment of malaria, very important during World War II. And John says it was the tenor and seriousness of this article that just pulled him in. And he knew immediately that's what he wanted to do with his life's work. So what he did was hopped in the car and drove down to Beltsville, Maryland to meet with B.Y. Morrison. B.Y. Morrison was the editor of the magazine at that time. He was also head of the Office of Foreign Plant Exploration and Introduction. And to talk about John Creech is to learn a little bit about the history of that office. John absolutely loved the history of that office, the people, their work. There were some amazing plantsmen that were a part of that. And John was just, he just loved them. He loved their stories. They had education from just some incredible institutions, Harvard, UC Berkeley, University of Michigan. B.Y. Morrison fascinated John because in addition to being such a knowledgeable plantsman, he had an incredible voice and had trained for the Metropolitan Opera. So John just ate up this history and the people that were part of that. Just a little bit about that office. It had been started in the late 1890s by David Fairchild. David Fairchild of the book The World Was My Garden, David Fairchild of the David Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden in Florida. He was the first director of the office. He hired Frank Meyer to be one of the first plant hunters for this country, USDA, did major expeditions in China and other places in the world. Now I'm going to tell this story. John loved to tell this story about the odyssey of a plant, from the time it may be collected somewhere in another country and its travels to become a useful plant or not. As part of this story, I'm going to say the words Bradford Pear, so bear with me. Don't throw your hands up and say, oh no, not that plant. But John loved reading about Frank Meyer. Frank Meyer would send letters when he was out collecting in other countries. He would send letters back. And these letters, along with letters of other plant hunters, were filed in the attic of the office building where John worked. And in the afternoons, he liked to steal away and go to this attic and read about their adventures. And Frank Meyer was sent to China in 1918, 2 years before John was born, to collect plants, but he was specifically looking for something that would address the fire blight in pears, because fire blight was destroying pears, the pear industry in this country. So he was over there collecting. He sent back these letters and talked about, he was in a war-torn area of China at the time, Civil War. He witnessed some atrocious things. He would write about these in his letters about witnessing people being killed and soldiers cutting out the hearts of people they killed to eat the hearts for courage. And mixed in with this information was information about collecting plants. And John was just riveted by these letters. And what happened is Meyer collected several pounds of the calorie pear. And at some point, he was on a boat, a few weeks after he collected these, was on a boat on the Yangtze River, and not long after, his body was found on the banks of the river. And to this day, no one knows what happened to him. They do not know if he was a victim of foul play. They don't know if he jumped overboard himself. They don't know if he accidentally fell overboard. But the plants, the germplasm, whether it's seeds, roots, plants, were shipped back to the Chico station in California and remained there for quite a while. A few decades later, there were 4 plants left from these calorie pear seeds that he had collected. and someone dug them up and sent them to the Glendale station. That's where John started his work with USDA, was splitting his time between Beltsville, Maryland, and the Glendale station. His boss was F.C. Bradford. And every afternoon, John and Mr. Bradford would walk the station grounds, Mr. Bradford pointing out projects he wanted John to work on or discussing their projects. And one afternoon, Mr. Bradford pointed to 4 scraggly trees over at the edge of the research station and suggested that John work on those trees. So John was a little bit skeptical about them, but he set to work. And taking buds from these calorie pears, grafting them onto other pears, and came up with this tree that he was pretty pleased with its pretty fall foliage, the snowy blooms in the spring, and the bright green foliage in the spring. And in about the 1980s, Smithsonian Magazine wrote an article about this whole odyssey as well. And they said that in this act of marketing genius, John decided to plant the trees in a neighborhood in Chevy Chase, Maryland, about 50 of these trees, because he was trying to figure out a way to introduce them to the industry. And when they bloomed, they just took off in popularity. Now, about the time, or at the time he was working on these, Mr. Bradford collapsed and died on one of his afternoon walks. And in honor of him, John named the tree the Bradford Pear. Now, John and I had some conversations about the Bradford Pear, and especially how it's fallen from grace in recent years. And John, on some occasions, would be a little more philosophical and say, well, you know, people have to understand that when a plant collector is out in the field collecting, he or she is not going to necessarily know what the result will be from that collection, because it could be used in research in a way that's just not expected. In this case, Frank Meyer did what he was asked to do. He was asked to find something that was resistant to fire blight. And indeed, it was resistant to fire blight. And he said, so that's just kind of part of it. You may not know for many decades later if it's going to be of use or no use. At other times, there was another time we talked about it, and he was a little defensive about it and said, well, you know, if nurserymen would prune the tree right, people just wouldn't have a problem with it. But I think overall, because it connected him to Frank Meyer, whom he greatly admired, because he risked his life to collect plants that would be of use for this country, connected him to Mr. Bradford. He really liked to share the odyssey of plants and liked to use the story to explain that. Another major person, I'm just going to go through these really quickly. Donovan Carell was somebody in the office that became John's mentor. He studied potatoes, sweet potatoes. At that time, they did a lot of work on economic food crops. But these people would have plants that they would be passionate about. In Carell's case, it was orchids. He's written several books on them. And I just realized recently why he was so interested in the potatoes. He was actually from Wilson, North Carolina. Some of the other people in that office at that time, and John says when he walked into this office, he felt like he was walking into the footsteps of the giants. From these people who explored, but also people like E.H. Wilson, that he really walked into this world that he knew were just these major figures. Howard Gentry had worked on rubber trees for the rubber industry for World War II, also traveled in many countries. Walter Hodge had been John's instructor at the University of Massachusetts, but also had done a lot of plant explorations. Russell Seibert, a key figure for John because he was leaving USDA about the time John started, and he went to Longwood Gardens, which would be instrumental in many of John's explorations. Bernice Schubert, amazing person because the only female of the bunch, if any of you are looking to do a biography, think about Bernie Schubert, because she's just amazing. Think about a woman at that time being in with all these men doing the plant collecting. She did collections for pharmaceutical plants, specifically looking for properties that could help treat heart disease, but all kinds of different ailments. And then William Whitehouse was an older gentleman when John started there, but he's known as the father of the pistachio industry. There are so many more, but these are just a few when John started. And as you can tell from this, from the time he started there for several years, that office was sending plant hunters around the world to collect for useful plants for this country. And John's job during that time was to propagate the plant. When he was at the Glendale station, it all came into the Glendale station. Every plant that comes into this country had to go into quarantine. He would propagate the plant material, take care of it, catalog it. He loved reading about the different plants that were coming in, because the plant collectors they would write characteristics of the plant, maybe characteristics or information about where it was collected, or a story. John absolutely ate this up. He had to do this for close to 8 years, and it only whetted his appetite to get out there himself and explore. And in 1955, his dream finally came true. And this is when his love affair with Japan began. His mentor, Donovan Carell, called him up in early 1955 and said, "How would you like to go to Japan to collect plants?" And that was his dream. He ended up traveling Japan has 4 major islands: Hokkaido in the north, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu down in the south. Several small islands off of the southern coast as well that he explored. And this was his absolute dream. He called it a plant collector's paradise. E.H. Wilson, who had explored for the Arnold Arboretum, had called it a plant collector's paradise, especially Yakushima off the southern part of Japan. But because of the diverse vegetation there was one of his major interests. And it had been probably about 25 years before the United States had anyone in Japan. We'd had World War II. And so no one had been there for many, many years. And so there were some specific plants that they were interested in John collecting. He was the first plant hunter after World War II to go into Japan. He often talked about the climatic analogs between Japan and the United States. And if you look at it latitudinally, northeastern United States and over here to Japan. So he would make that comparison a lot to talk about why Japan was so significant for this country. So on this first trip in 1955, USDA is really not interested in ornamental plants. They're more interested in what they call the economic food crops. And so that's what John was asked to collect. He also got requests from research stations and different people across the country with their list of plants they wanted him to collect. They did have a few of the ornamentals on there, but it was primarily for these economic food crops. One of the first people John met in Japan was a gentleman named Kaname Kato, an amazing man from what John has said about him. Mr. Kato sat down with John and helped him map out his trips in Japan. He introduced him to other scientists, other plantsmen in Japan. Really just took a lot of time to spend with John, which really helped make his trip successful. Mr. Kato and John became lifelong friends. John, as I said, he explored that whole island, the whole country, that first trip. From the southern part in Kyushu, he loved Chiron, the home of the samurai. He loved the history, the culture of Japan. But behind these beautiful green walls, he might find beautiful rock gardens. He collected everywhere. You know, my picture when I first started with him is that he was always out in the wild. If he was in one of these gardens and he saw a plant he was interested in, he asked to get a cutting of the plant. So it could have been private gardens, it could have been botanic gardens, it could have been research stations or out in the wild. Everywhere he was looking for plants. He liked those borrowed landscapes, that mountain in the background. Collected even tea from tea plantations. He collected in the Kirishima National Forest, the Kagoshima area down in the southern part. He, even later when he retired, he took nurserymen on trips all over Japan to collect in all of these areas. The Kurumi Research Station, Azalea Research Station in Kurumi down on that southern island of Kyushu, very important. That's where the original Kurumi azaleas were found. E.H. Wilson introduced those. Met scientists there that he would be in contact with throughout his career. Then he traveled back up through Shikoku, a little bit more rugged island, and then back on to Honshu. Honshu, the island that has Tokyo, Kyoto, Nikko. Dr. Oba was one of the people that he worked with at Tokyo University. He's a botanist there. Tokyo University has a botanical garden. They're also affiliated with the Nikko Botanical Garden. John spent a lot of time there. Dr. Oba got out the guest book and showed me where John had signed in 1980 when he was visiting there. They keep records of all this. They loved Dr. Creech. And Dr. Oba is known as the Emperor's botanist because the Emperor has a strong plant background, loves to learn about plants, talk about plants, often visits Tokyo University Botanic Gardens, but also Nikko. And it's funny because aside from my interpreter when I went there to kind of retrace John's steps in Japan, the first person I met was Dr. Oba and got to spend the day with him at the Nikko Garden. And that evening when I got back to my hotel in Tokyo, I turned on the TV and he was on television, which I thought was pretty amazing. He shared with me that John loved this particular rhododendron. The mountains, this picture does not do it justice, but it's just flush with these beautiful rhododendron. John liked to visit the nursery areas of Japan, and again, he took a lot of nurserymen from the U.S. and Great Britain over to visit all of Japan, but especially the nursery area north of Tokyo. Have any of you been to this nursery area in Japan? It is amazing. There are miles and miles and miles of nurseries in one area, and one might focus just on Japanese maples, and another one an evergreen, and another one yet another plant. And it's got to be a plants person's candy store. It's totally overwhelming because it's just miles and miles of these beautiful nurseries. The Shibamichi nursery is one that John would visit, also take nurserymen to. And Mr. Shibamichi, these nurseries are handed down from generation to generation. Mr. Shibamichi was 5th generation. His son will be 6th to run this nursery. And he believes John was the first American to visit his nursery. And he said that he was absolutely amazed that an American knew so much about plants. This is Mr. Shibamichi. And he was really excited to show me this plant. And you don't know how excited I was that I could say, oh, it's Calycanthus Venus, which is significant because that plant was developed by Tom Rainey at our Mountain Horticultural Crop Center. And Mr. Shibamichi was so excited to show me this plant. But this is our scenes from his nursery there. This is a funny story about this plant. I took this picture there, and I could not remember what this plant was. And so a few weeks ago, I sent it to a horticulture agent that I used to work with to ask him what the plant was. And he said, I'm not sure, but I'll talk with let me send it to the plant guru. And so a few days later, he forwarded me this email from the plant guru who said, it looks like a variegated dove tree, and that looks like Shiba Michi-san's place. And I just had to laugh because I thought the plant guru, Mark Wethington, can identify not only the plant but the nursery from looking at this picture. John loved to visit the shrines in Japan, and if you've been to Japan, you know they're all over the place. He received a special permit to collect on Mount Fuji. Not everybody can collect on Mount Fuji, but he, along with some of the Japanese scientists, got permission to collect there. He loved the northern island of Hokkaido and loved its history because its history is so tied to the United States. When the Japanese wanted to settle that island in the late 1800s, they turned to William Smith Clark of the University of Massachusetts to come over and help start a college of agriculture on Hokkaido. And Clark also recruited several other Westerners. So when John traveled there and learned of this history, he ended up doing numerous articles about the history. It's got more, you can look see from that building, it's got more of a Western influence there. Clark was there about a year, not quite a year, and when he was leaving there, all of the students from the College of Agriculture rode out on horseback to bid him goodbye. He was on horseback, heading off. And the story goes that, the horse rears up on his hind legs and he turns and yells, "Boys, be ambitious." And John loves this story because they still use this slogan today. They've dropped the word boys, but be ambitious is part of the slogan. But he did a lot of explorations on this island. He did a lot of articles about the L. Boehmer and Company. This was the first Western nursery in Japan. This person had helped start the College of Agriculture, but he started a nursery in Japan. And John says that it had a profound impact on the array of Japanese plants that are so prominent in our garden. And this is one of the early catalogs from that nursery that's actually hand-tinted. Beautiful catalog. I had to put this in here because of your publication called The Trillium. This is a trillium expert that John worked with frequently, Dr. Samajima, who would collect with John in the mountains of Hokkaido. And these are his illustrations, some that he presented to me when I was there. Dr. Samajima attended Vanderbilt University and has done a lot of collecting in our mountains, loves the United States. So on that first trip, that was really a survey of the whole island for John to get an idea of what was there, what he wanted to collect, because he knew he was going to be going back. And indeed, in 1956, the following year he did, and everything changed because Longwood Gardens helped sponsor this trip. And Longwood Gardens wanted ornamental trips. And it was on this trip that John could really collect what he wanted to. This is Dr. Creech right here, Dr. Takeda, and their party in 56. And one of the key places he wanted to go in 56 was to Yakushima. And it is on Yakushima where he collected the seeds for Lagerstromia forii. And they had been collecting about 10 hours one day searching for this plant on this island. They were in an area with the cryptomeria were being logged, a lot of clear cutting going on in that area. And he was beginning to lose hope that he would not find this plant. But after about 10 hours, they did find the tree, collected a lot of the seeds for this plant. And those are the seeds that were used by Donald Egoff in the breeding program for crepe myrtles, which most of our crepe myrtles derive today, the series with all the Indian names. What was so important about this is that it has resistance to powdery mildew. It's more cold hardy. Lots of crepes from Lagerstromia that have been introduced, and now the miniature hybrids. Bobby mentioned that seeds were sent here, and there were two trees, Fantasy and Townhouse, and this is a picture of Fantasy here from the Arboretum, which I think is just absolutely beautiful. I love Denny Werner's photo here. Tim mentioned that this had to be June or July because of that exfoliating bark. This is a picture of Dr. Creech here at the Arboretum in 1991 with the trees. Those seeds were sent out to lots of different gardens. And that would typically happen. If someone requested seeds from an exploration, it could be a private individual, it could be a botanic garden, a research station, they would usually get them. Some of the other notable plants, he collected a particular camellia that was used in breeding programs, fragrant flowering camellia. Dr. William Ackerman worked with John, but he also introduced many camellias from that particular camellia that John collected. These are just a few of Dr. Ackerman's introductions. The hemerocallis, the daylily, John was particularly proud of a fall flowering daylily, but there were several that he collected. On his trip for Longwood Gardens in '56, he collected many chrysanthemums. Chrysanthemums are the flower of the imperial family, and one of the introductions was called Tokyo White, and here he is inspecting some of the chrysanthemums at Longwood the following year in '57. The Chrysanthemum pacificum, another plant. Here he is collecting Rhododendron japonicum in Kyushu. Just real quickly, a few of the other plants here. The Loropetalum burgundy and blush were named by Skip March. Skip is someone who worked with John at USDA. John really looked at Skip as a son. But the Euonymus greenspire, the emerald sea juniper, several rhododendrons, the green cushion, cotoneaster. The Prunus snowcloud and Farrah Lane. Farrah Lane was actually named for his second wife. Number of azaleas. There's the B.Y. Morrison azalea. There's a Ben Morrison azalea. The Deutzia Nico. Sedum John Creech. This was actually collected in Siberia in 1971, and someone else named the plant. I may have to talk with Tony about who that was. I've found some information, but I just need to confirm that. But John was really proud that this plant was being grown on the roof of the North Carolina Arboretum, one of their green roofs. So John absolutely loved plant exploration. He called it the greatest game. And during his career, when he started at USDA, he was able to complete a doctorate at the University of Maryland. He became president of the American Horticultural Society. He rose through the ranks and became chief of the New Crops Branch section. That the name from the Office of Foreign Plant Exploration changed at some point to New Crops Research Branch. He did many explorations. In addition to Japan, he went to Nepal, USSR, Taiwan, Yugoslavia, but Japan was his real love. He went there numerous explorations. Became director of the National Arboretum. In '74, he was part of the National Academy of Science delegation to China. And many other trips. He's won just about every horticultural medal that you can name. But in the early '70s, he became director of the National Arboretum. Always loved azaleas because B.Y. Morrison was an azalea person, and then Henry Skinner, who was the second director of the Arboretum, loved azaleas, and they just passed that love of that plant on. During his tenure, the National Herb Garden was installed at the Arboretum. This is one of the stories that John absolutely loved about the bicentennial gift in 1976 of the bonsai. When, about 1973, John was trying to figure out how the National Arboretum could be involved in the 200th anniversary of this country. And he started thinking that maybe Japan could provide some bonsai to the garden. And he turned to people that were very important to him, going back to that first trip. Kaname Kato, who was his good friend in Japan. Eugene Yoshimura is someone that he met on that first trip, comes from a long line of bonsai masters. And when the Brooklyn Botanic Garden was looking for someone to teach the art of bonsai, John recommended that they hire Eugene Yoshimura, who did come from Japan to work with the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. So John turned to both of them when he was just starting to think in '73 about this possible gift from the Japanese. And it is an absolutely amazing story about how he made that happen. You can imagine dealing with the bureaucracy of two countries. It was quite a challenge to convince the Japanese, because at some point they had provided a gift of a bonsai, a very important bonsai. Bonsai are like family members to them, and many of them are centuries old. And they had presented one to this country a few years earlier. And because of regulations with quarantine in this country, when plants are brought in, at that time in particular, they couldn't have soil on them. So all the soil had to be removed from the bonsai tree, and it died. And it didn't do a lot of good with the relationships between Japan and this country for us to kill one of their treasured bonsai. So John had to convince the authorities in DC to allow this gift of bonsai for these plants to come into the country with the soil intact, because they wanted to make sure that they increased the chances of these plants being shipped over here and being able to live. He was granted that permission, and he's thinking he's only going to get a few bonsai. And it turns out the Japanese gave one for every state, 50, and then the imperial family gave an additional 3. So that's how we ended up with 53 bonsai, and then the 6 viewing stones. And John is headed over, he and Skip March go to accept this gift from the Japanese people. They're going to bring this over a year in advance so the plants can stay in quarantine, be taken care of, so then they can be on public viewing in 1976. And John's given a little over $2,000 to ship these plants back. And when he gets to Japan, they have all kinds of ceremonies planned to hand over these plants, because they are precious plants to these people, just amazing gifts. And it's just a real funny story, because John says he nearly had a heart attack when he walked in the room and saw these plants and saw how big they were. And they were building these huge crates to put them in, and they had this layer on the bottom that would cushion them, so when they're on the plane, that they're gonna have this shock absorber. And John nearly has a heart attack because he knows $2,000 will not cover the shipping of these plants to this country. And he also knows that one phone call to Washington will not grant him permission. And so he knows he's got to make it happen. What he doesn't know is if he's going to have a job when he gets back, after he gets these plants back over here. But he knows he's going to have a big bill, because it ended up costing $19,000 to ship these plants over here. He and Skip March, when they load these plants on the plane, there's no room for them on the plane, and they end up riding in the cargo hold with these plants to get them back safely to this country. Now, of course, the Japanese found out about that, and they absolutely loved him all the more for taking care of their beloved plants. Anytime an emperor or somebody from the imperial family has been over here to visit, they specifically ask to see the tree that their family gave. It did result in the first bonsai museum in the world. And John has said that the gift of the bonsai has been the most important role played by plants in furthering the diplomatic relationship between Japan and the U.S. since the presentation of the flowering cherries beginning in the early 20th century. By the way, David Fairchild in that office was instrumental in that particular gift. When John retired in the early 80s, he moved to North Carolina. And by the way, I don't know if you know this, but 3 of the first 4 directors of the National Arboretum retired to North Carolina. B.Y. Morrison the first retired to Mississippi. Henry Skinner the second retired to Hendersonville, North Carolina. John followed him when he retired, moved to Hendersonville, North Carolina. Mark Cathy was a native of Davidson, North Carolina, and retired to Davidson. I think that's pretty amazing. And but John helped start the North Carolina Arboretum. Someone gave a large gift of bonsai to the Arboretum, and Arthur Jura was selected or appointed as the curator for that collection. And so John was very instrumental in making sure Arthur could go to Japan to get training from bonsai master there, and also Washington, D.C. So very involved in trying to use his connections to help other gardens, other plantsmen. And of course, I don't think anyone can talk about any plant collector without using this well-known quote from Thomas Jefferson: "The greatest service which can be rendered any country is to add a useful plant to its culture." I believe, obviously, the plants were very important when it comes to the horticultural legacy of John Creech. He had numerous successions, numerous introductions for gardeners, but I believe it was his relationships and connections with people that was so important, and how he used them to help people. He introduced numerous American nurserymen to nurserymen and scientists in Japan, and vice versa, scientists from Japan, and really all over the world, to American scientists. He was a mentor. He always liked to hear about how young horticulturists, young plantsmen were doing. He liked to keep up with them. He was really impressed with what's going on at the Mountain Research Center. He was an historian. He wrote lots of articles and had lots of interest when it came not just to about the plants, but about people involved with them. And I believe he was certainly a visionary leader. I think how he arranged for this huge gift of bonsai and the public relations work that was involved in that. He was really someone that was a very astute in helping get these things worked through a bureaucratic system. But more than anything, I think it's just being this goodwill ambassador through plants, and building relationships with other countries, other people, that was so important. And so long ago, that one article that he read changed his life. It ended up being him being able to walk in the footsteps of the giants, and then he was able to become one himself. I want to thank you for your invitation to talk today about Dr. Creech. I think he was an amazing person. I set the project aside. You know, sometimes life circumstances can influence what we do, and so because of that, I set the project aside a while. But I want to thank you for your invitation, because in preparing this, it's got me back into working on getting this book finished. So I hope the next time I see you, it can be to share a published book with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Leah, very much. Any questions for Leah? We're certainly looking forward to the book. It was nice to learn so much about it.
Can I just say one thing? I was just amazed. I had no idea that wonderful crepe myrtle was only there since 1950s. I thought it had been there for years before that.
Uh-huh.
And I just never realized. I thought it was a native plant of the South. That shows how much I know. Yeah, that's just,
I have a bit of a personal connection with John Creech. I lived in Reston, Virginia, which was one of the 2 planned communities in the Washington, D.C. area. And they had a collection of plants that were moved ahead of the bulldozers. And he was very interested in Reston as a community that preserved some of the plants in the planting, and he spoke a couple of times that I attended the Reston Garden Club.
Oh, great.
Very small
Uh-huh.
connection, but
To get your name.
I have one comment. There was a farmer's bulletin on iris by a fellow by the name of B.Y. Morrison.
Yes.
And you've talked here, and this is not criticism, but it illustrates the point. You've talked here all this time and never mentioned iris at all.
I didn't mention a lot of plants, did I? There were so many. You know, just to look at his list of the collections, I mean, it's amazing. I was looking at one the other day, I can't remember what year, but just the Acer, the maples. I mean, just pages just of that one plant. So, and he collected so many. So, yeah, it's amazing.
So what was the source of that bonsai collection in Asheville?
Oh goodness, I would have to go back. I don't know if I can recall the name of the people right now, but it was a private individual who donated the collection.
From Georgia, I think it was.
Was it?
Can you mention briefly about being a prisoner of war, what happened there, growing plants, if you don't mind? I know it's a long
Okay.
story, but
Okay,
Yes.
just real quick. Well, I think what's so amazing about the prisoner of war garden, John, you know, had developed this love working in the greenhouse on his brother's farm, went to University of Rhode Island, actually worked in the greenhouse as a student. He's captured, taken prisoner of war, sent to the far reaches of Poland, and walking the grounds of this prisoner of war camp, which happened to be a former boys' school. And what does he discover there? A greenhouse. And he asked his commanding officer for permission to grow plants in the greenhouse, and the Germans refused. And his commanding officer kept asking, and finally they were granted use of the greenhouse. And John ended up growing plants in that greenhouse and ended up helping feed about 1,500 POWs that were in that camp. It's just an amazing story about his experience at that prisoner of war camp in Poland.
Any other questions or comments for Leah? All right, Rick, thanks very much again.